Now that you have an understanding of what classical economics basic beliefs are and the time period of classical economics, we're now going to get into the model. And the models for classical economics really focus on, are really based on four key assumptions. So those key assumptions are, in no particular order here, prices are flexible, wages are flexible, interest rates are flexible, I believe those are the three that the book includes, and I'm just adding a fourth that I think is really important as well, and that's basically that people are informed and make rational decisions. So what we're going to do now is go through each of these and start talking about why these are important. And to really understand them well, we need to understand them well before we show the graphs and the models for classical economics, because these are so important in understanding why classical economics is the way it is, and why people believe the certain things are in classical economics. And they're probably even more important in understanding why Keynes in chapter 10 disagreed with the classical economics. He basically didn't believe that these assumptions would hold up in the real world. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these. Okay, and we're going to introduce some new graphs as we go through these. So there's a lot to unravel from these assumptions. So the first one here is that prices are flexible, and this is necessary for individual markets to operate correctly. Okay, and we're focusing on the individual market now. Probably in the next video you'll see why this affects the overall economy. But here's the basic reason why, and this isn't new to you. The basic reason why this is so important is if we're talking about any market, and here's supply and here's demand, and let's imagine that this is our starting point, and we start out at equilibrium. Okay, so that's just some generic market. And let's say that demand increases. Okay, so demand increases to a new level here. Well, if prices aren't flexible, and I'm going to erase this old demand curve just to make sure we can see exactly what's happening here. If prices aren't flexible, if prices remain here, well, look at the problem this is going to create. If prices remain there, now our quantity supplied is significantly less than our quantity demanded. In other words, we have a shortage. So the reason it's important for prices is to be flexible is markets are only going to reach equilibrium when prices are indeed flexible. This is important because remember, classical economics, the basic belief here is laissez-faire economics, the idea that the government doesn't have to get involved. Okay, so one key element of that is in regards to prices. So if prices are flexible, markets generally won't need government intervention to reach equilibrium. And we talked back in chapter 3 about why we think equilibrium would happen, and what we discussed there is really the same concepts we're discussing here. Prices need to be flexible. Makes a lot of sense that they would be, but Keynes is going to bring up some points of why maybe they wouldn't always be real flexible in the real world. Okay? So prices need to be flexible. That's necessary for individual markets to operate correctly. It's also necessary for the economy to operate correctly, and we'll see that in the next video. Okay, the second one is that wages need to be flexible. And to discuss this, we're going to need to draw up a new market, the market for labor. So it's basic supply and demand, just like you've seen before, but with different labels attached to the supply and demand. So let's do that first. Before we can really discuss why it needs to be flexible, we need to see the market and understand it. So down here is going to be the quantity of labor. And this is the number of you can put it in terms of hours or workers. It's the number of workers the businesses want to hire, and it's also the number of workers who want to work, okay? So you might think of that in hours. Maybe you want to work 42 hours a week, so your labor that you're willing to supply is 42 hours, okay? And then here, instead of price, rather than put price, we're going to put wage, all right? So wage is just the price of labor. And once you see this, you'll realize that wages must be flexible is very similar to saying prices must be flexible. After all, a wage is just a price. It's just a price for the workers. But the one unique thing about wages is if these markets are out of whack, that's especially problematic. If the market for tacos, as we've talked about before, if it's out of whack, it's probably just going to affect those people in that market. But if wages are out of whack, if this market fails, that could be a disaster, right? That could be exorbitant unemployment or other problems that could affect our entire economy. So the basic scenario here, and we can talk about the market for just about anything, but let's say the market for low-skilled labor. Just like there's lots of different markets for goods and services, there's also a lot of different labor markets. And one market is the market for low-skilled labor. People who maybe don't have a high school degree, or people who are very young who don't really have any training or anything yet. Okay, so this is the market for low-skilled labor. And we're going to have two sides of the market here. We're going to have the labor supply. And we're going to have the labor demand. And the one thing you have to be careful here is making sure you understand which is which, because things are a little bit confusing here. It does make sense once you understand it, but it's an easy place to trip up. Usually we're used to supply being businesses because they're selling products. But in the case of labor, what's being sold? The workers are selling their time, right? So if I get hired for my contract, I'm selling my time to the university who's paying for it, okay? So the labor supply is the workers. And this shows the graph. This graph shows the relationship between wages and the amount of time worked, which probably would be best to think about in terms of hours. So that's this labor supply side. And then the labor demand, we're used to labor demand being, when we say demand, we're thinking about consumers. But what's being purchased now is the workers. So if I pay somebody, I'm purchasing them, essentially. So labor demand, this is actually the businesses, the firms. So this shows the relationship between, again, wages and the number of hours the businesses would like to hire. If you will. It's kind of a strange way of putting it, but that's basically what's happening, right? If I need somebody to come out to my house and fix my plumbing, I'm essentially saying I need to hire somebody, and maybe it takes 15 hours. That's the amount of hours I need to hire someone. So we've got labor supply and we've got labor demand. This is a new market, but ultimately there's not a whole lot new for you to learn here. It operates pretty much the same as basic supply and demand, and this market can have the same sorts of problems as the market for any other products. So for example, if wages are like this, okay, this is a high wage, so I'm going to put wage H for a high wage. What problem is that going to create? Well, you end up with this being the quantity of labor supplied, okay? So it's like quantity supplied like we saw in product markets, but now it's a quantity of labor supplied. And then over here, you have the quantity of labor demanded. And ultimately what that would suggest is if quantity of labor supplied is greater than the quantity of labor demanded, we have essentially a surplus of labor. There's too many people wanting to work at this wage. So what do you think would happen? Well, probably wages would drop towards equilibrium. All right? Wages would drop because the businesses would realize there's lots of people willing to work. So they realize, look, we can pay people less now. There's plenty of people we can hire, so let's drop our wages and hire some of these people who are not working. So wages would probably drop. And if we have a shortage, same sort of deal. Wages would probably adjust towards that equilibrium. And at the equilibrium, which is, again, ideal, just like it is in product markets, the beauty of that is everyone essentially gets a job, okay? Everyone gets a job in this market. And one way to think about this is maybe this equilibrium really means we have 4.5% unemployment at this equilibrium, so it's kind of the best case scenario. So really all we're saying here with wages must be flexible is the same thing we saw with prices. If wages are flexible, then no government intervention is necessary. Equilibrium will be reached without the government interfering. Now, imagine you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about when government does get involved in wages, for example, with minimum wages? Well, that's something we're going to have to address in Chapter 10. So prices must be flexible, wages must be flexible. And then it's the third one that's actually the most crucial. The third one is the one that really explains the biggest difference between what you're going to see in Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. So the third one is that interest rates must be flexible. And all of these things really need to happen for classical economics to work, for classical economics to be correct. Yet again, we've got another market we've got to discuss. Okay? So the good thing is hopefully you understand supply and demand pretty well at this point because we're applying it now. That's when we went through it in the past. And so what we're going to show now is the market for loanable funds. The market for loanable funds. This is the market for people who want to borrow money and the market for people who want to save money. And specifically loanable funds because we're thinking about the money that is truly saved in the economic sense. And when I say savings, I've mentioned this before, I believe, in a prior video. When I say savings, I'm talking about when you save your money in a way where other people are able to borrow it. So for example, if you put your money in the bank loans most of that money out. So that would be in the market for loanable funds. Whereas if you keep your money at your house, right, if you've got like, $1,000 you hide somewhere, that actually wouldn't be in this market because there's no way it's being loaned out to anyone. All right, so what we're going to show here is instead of price and quantity, we need to think about what we're really showing. Down here is going to be QLF, which is the quantity of loanable funds. And that's the amount of money being saved and borrowed. All right? So we got the quantity of loanable funds. This is actually an interesting thing to realize is this is actually in dollars. Okay? It's in dollars because it's an amount of money. We're thinking about the quantity of money being saved and borrowed. And then what would be the price? When you think about borrowing or saving, what is equivalent to the price here? So in other words, if the price is low for a good, that makes consumers want to buy it. Well, what would need to be low for people to want to borrow money? Interest rates, right? The lower the interest rate, the more likely you are to try to demand funds or borrow funds. So up here is going to be I, the interest rate. And hopefully you guys all understand interest rates relatively well. And interest rate is just the price of borrowing and the benefit of saving. So if the interest rate is, say, 5% for borrowing, that means if I borrow $1,000, I'm going to have to pay $1,050 back at the end of a year if my loan there is just 1 year. Okay. On the contrary, if you're saving money, if you save $1,000 at 5% interest, that would mean every year it would grow 5%. So if I put $1,000 in a bank and that bank is giving me, let's say, 2% interest, then I'd have $1,020 at the end of the year. So high interest rates are good for savers, bad for borrowers. Low interest rates, good for borrowers, bad for savers. Okay, so it's hard to say what's a good savings rate. It's kind of like saying, well, what's a good price? Depends on if you're the buyer or the seller. Okay, so we have again, this is still just a market, even though we're labeling things differently. This is still supply and demand. So the first graph we're going to show here is the upward sloping one, and this is supply. And in the case of this, what's being supplied is money. Okay, so what we're going to label this as is savers. Okay, and savers represents the supply of money. And it's upward sloping because as the interest rates increase, savings increase. Okay? The higher the interest rate is, the more likely you are to save your money, which I think makes pretty general sense there, right? The higher the interest rate, the more likely you are to save your money. So, for example, if I told you I want to borrow $100 and I'll pay you $100 back tomorrow, there's really nothing in it for you. But if I say I need to borrow $100, I'm going to pay you $200 tomorrow. It's that boost, that interest that I'm offering you that's going to make it so incentivizing to you to want to take on that loan. So as the interest rate goes up, savers want to save more money. And then on the other side of it, in the book they call it investment. I'm just going to call it borrowing. Borrowers or borrowing. Again, the book calls it investment. I find students have a little trouble with that term. Investment is something we think of in a lot of different ways. So borrowers, I think, is a good way to put this because it explains exactly what these individuals are doing. This is the demand for money. They're buying money, essentially. They're buying money today, and they're going to pay it back in the future. So they're purchasing money, and they're going to pay it back in the future. So they're the borrowers. And the basic rule here, though, follows the law of demand. As interest rates go up, borrowing decreases, which makes a lot of sense, right? Higher interest rates discourage borrowing. So that's our market for loanable funds. You need to understand the differences in terms of the subtleties of what we're actually discussing here and why it's different from basic supply and demand. But that being said, it operates, again, like supply and demand. Pretty much the same as any supply and demand that we've done in this class. And the reason the interest rates need to be flexible is really for the same reasons that prices and quantities need to be flexible. Because we could have an interest rate that, for example, is too high. Just like we saw wages being high. All right? Or we could show prices being high in a regular market. If we have this scenario here, then the quantity borrowed is a lot less than the quantity saved. So a lot more money is being saved than borrowed. This is a big problem if this happens, okay? And in Chapter 10, we're going to start out by talking about this a lot. But the basic result here, sticking with classical economics and keeping it in that context, is interest rates need to be flexible. For this market to reach equilibrium. The classical economists thought it was flexible. They figured interest rates would be flexible, and therefore the government wouldn't need to get involved in this market. So the government doesn't need to get involved in prices, wages, or savings and borrowing. These are the three big markets. If you think about the markets you're in, the markets you're involved in, I bet all of y'all are in those three markets, obviously at some point in your life, but probably most of you are right now. You're in the goods markets for sure because you're demanding goods. Maybe you're selling goods too. You're in the labor market if you have a job or if you're ever hiring anyone. And you're in this market if you use a bank or ever borrow money. For me, I'm on both sides of this market, which is very strange. A lot of people end up on both sides of these markets simultaneously. I've borrowed money, right? I borrowed money for a house. Actually, I borrowed money for a couple of houses right now. I'm trying to sell one. And in terms of saving, I have bank accounts. I have an account at a couple of different banks. I have stocks. I have bonds, right? I have money in investments. So people end up in these markets a lot. That's part of what makes this market so important, is so many people are tied into it. And that takes us up to the last assumption. Assumption number 4. And this is the basic idea that people must be informed and make rational decisions. And I've added this one. This one's not in the book, but this is just to point out that if people are just doing crazy stuff, for example, if I'm running a business and I've got prices all over the place and I'm not even thinking about what the consumers want, well, then markets aren't going to act very well, okay? Basically, the markets are going to fail because this assumption is failing. So all I'm really saying here is, for an economy to operate as the classical economists expected, people need to know what choices are best and then act on those choices. In other words, not only do I need to know that, for example, let's say I've got a bunch of goods I can't sell, I need to know that to sell those goods I need to drop the price, and I also need to act on it, okay? Or if, for example, there's two businesses downtown that are both selling coffee and one's better and they're the same price, I need to know the one that's better. I need to know it's better, and I need to act accordingly by buying that coffee. This is going to ensure that the economy operates smoothly. It's going to reward the businesses that are doing the best. Or if I'm hiring a worker, I should know which workers are best, okay, at least have some idea of that, and I should hire the workers based on the ones that are most capable. This ensures that our incentives are in place. If I start just hiring people randomly and don't care about their qualities, well, then that's going to disincentivize the workers to try to get training, to try to get education, to try to conduct good interviews. So this is basically saying that people need to be rational, make good choices, be predictable, because ultimately that's how classical economists expected people to act. Okay? If this fails, the other assumptions fail, the model probably fails with it. Okay, so that's the end of this section 2 of chapter 9, but we've still got a lot to tackle in this chapter, so I'm going to end it right here. Next chapter, or the next section of this chapter, we're going to talk about why the markets fix themselves and actually look at the big picture, look at the macroeconomic model, short and aggregate supply, aggregate demand, the stuff we talked about back in chapter 8.